Welcome everybody again at our fourth panel of our conference entitled Thinking of the Crisis. Although the title of this panel, which is Political Dissolutions, might give an impression that we are now shifting away from yesterday's last talk on the obscene money and pretty woman presented by the Center for Wild Analysis, this impression is totally misleading. In fact, it seems to me that the issue of fascism, which will be at the core of today's first debate, can only radicalize the obscenity about which Aleš talked yesterday in his wonderful introduction. If the expression thinking of will double F from the title of the conference involves the meaning of the ability to achieve orgasm through thought, then I'm sure we will now make a step further on the scale of obscenity with respect to yesterday's collective thinking. So let me begin more seriously. In today's apparently chaotic situation in Europe, one of the convictions of many political subjects from the left side of political spectrum, as well as from the left side of civil society, is that fascism is rising again in Europe. We can agree that especially from 2008 on, when the greatest economic crisis after Great Depression hit the majority of Western economies, many far right-wing subjects, parties, movements, individuals, etc., emerged and started to acquire an important role in the field of politics, broadly speaking. However, it would perhaps be wrong to subsume many different subjects and their emergencies under a single reason of economic and financial crisis after 2008. Just to briefly mention some most representative examples. The circumstances of economic devastation of the country in which the Greek neo-Nazi party Golden Dawn occurred are quite different from the circumstances in which Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orbán took power. Furthermore, the Pegida movement in Germany appeared again due to different reasons, which are the refugee crisis and the masses of people coming to Europe from the Muslim world, which supposedly threatens the Christian fundaments of Europe. Although, as we can see, there are different contexts in which such a right-wing subjects appeared, in order to characterize them, the term fascism was revitalized again, albeit its different variations. The reply from the right to this revitalization is quite univocal. These subjects themselves claim that they are not fascist, Nazi, or something similar. On the contrary, they claim to be the only true democratic political subjects contesting the so-called technocratic form of political governance in Europe in favor of the sovereignty of national member states. They all propose themselves as the voice of the people, therefore as a democratic point of orientation and stabilization of apparently chaotic circumstances of crisis. Perhaps surprisingly, but precisely in this depiction of the present state of affairs resembles the parallel with the past. In fact, we should recall that historical fascism as well declared itself to be the most democratic political force, the most democratic representation of the will of the people. Here it's worth to mention, for example, Carl Schmitt's radical critic of liberal parliamentary democracy, especially some of its pilasters like secret ballot and individual voting, which are, according to Schmitt, just non-democratic ways of how secretly manipulate the will of the people by voting against publicly declared statements. Furthermore, in this context, it's worth to underline the reference to the nation-state, since exactly right-wing subjects seems to be fundamentally attached to it. Once the structure of power of the EU is denounced as alienated from the people and unable to act in problem-solving manner, the whole idea of European supranational association is also contested. As an alternative solution, right-wing parties, movements, and individuals propose a kind of regression to the strong nation-state and national sovereignty as its leading principle. In this context, the so-called Visegrad Group is emblematic. This is intra-EU alliance of member states which was established during the still ongoing refugee crisis in order to collectively reject the solution proposed by EU to divide the refugees to all member states in equal proportion with respect to their populations. All these countries refused this solution precisely by denouncing it as a non-democratic solution imposed from above and against the democratic will of their own citizens. At least partial parallel with the strong state in the context of historical fascism is more than obvious. Therefore, the question about the relation between historical and potentially contemporary fascism is more than justified. Is fascism a historical event which is irreparable and therefore today's use of the expression fascism or fascist is completely unjustified? Or, on the contrary, we are dealing today with a new kind of fascism which resembles enough the historical fascism that the expression at stake is just to use? Or, finally, should we take this expression not as a signifier which indicates something in the present time, but rather as a sign from the future, or as Jean-Pierre Dupuy would call it, that is to say, the signal for something that has still to come and is only latently present in today's reality? This third option somehow differs from the first two, which are both determined by the still predominant way of our understanding of the notion of evil. In her recent book, I nuovi demoni, The New Demons, Simona Forti, who is, by the way, a very close colleague of our today's speaker, Davide Tarizzo, whom I will introduce very soon. In this book, she argues that our contemporary understanding of evil is still caught in the trap of what she calls the Dostoevsky paradigm. According to Forti, this paradigm consists from, very simply put, the metaphysical substantialization of the evil. If Kant, in his essay, Religion within the limits of reason alone, insisted on the rejection, that's at least her argument, of the possibility of the evil actions that intentionally violate the moral law, and on the unacceptability of the existence of human beings who pursue evil for the sake of evil, this statement was radicalized and overturned by many post-Kantian thinkers, beginning with the SAZU. As we know already very well, the radicalization and the overturning of this Kant statement consist precisely from the fact that, as she says, transgression of law became identified as the main objective of evil, which means that there is an intention which generates the evil itself. This is what Forti calls the Dostoevsky paradigm, since in his last novels, such as Demons and The Brothers Karamazov, the great Russian writer depicted his main characters, such as, for example, Stavrogin, exactly in this way, as the embodiments of the evil, or as a will to nothingness. Because of this, she somehow considers the Dostoevsky paradigm as a regression into pre-Kantian metaphysical substantialization of the evil, which revolves around the question of who is the devil or where does the evil comes from. Finally, this manner of substantializing the evil is at the same time also the way of how it becomes absolutized and opposed to the good. For Forti, the problem of understanding of evil within this paradigm is clear enough. It only allows us to think the evil in dual relationship of active and powerful hangmen on the one hand and their passive and innocent victims on the other. Simply put, very, very simply put, bad things can be done only by the bad people. In this constellation, the whole genesis of the evil, of which this dual relationship between hangmen and their victims can only be considered as a final sin remains untaught. That's why Forti proposes to enlarge this picture and focuses on what she calls mediocre demons. Already the term itself highlights that we are dealing here not, or at least not only, with spectacular demons that would colonize the entire field of vision so that everybody could see them. On the contrary, the mediocre demon or modest evil is much more anonymous and much more hardly visible in everyday reality. As psychoanalysis would have claimed, it is something much more in accordance with the moral law rather than in contrast with it. By focusing on the absolute evil, we therefore often underestimate and overlook exactly this second kind of evil, which is much more fundamental, since it represents the origins of the first one. In this respect, it could be said that the notion of absolute evil still determines our predominant way of understanding fascism, which we still think in terms of fully present substance rather than in terms of acts and acting. Yesterday, when I talked with our today's guest, he said something that made me think. He said that the main problem of today, which concern our understanding of fascism, is that we still think the fascism at the basis of the old historical fascism. In my view, this can only mean that we still understand it in terms of the absolute evil. In order to clarify some of the above-mentioned dilemmas, I introduce you Professor Davide Tarizzo. Although Davide is already a frequent guest here, I'll nevertheless say something briefly, very briefly, about him and his work. Davide teaches moral philosophy at the University of Salerno and has written extensively on psychoanalysis, Freud and Lacan, French theory, political theory, and biopolitics. His major publications include Il desiderio dell'interpretazione, Lacan e la questione dell'essere, from 1998, and the English translation is forthcoming with the Bloomsbury. Then the Introduzione a Lacan from 2003, Il pensiero libero, la filosofia francese dopo lo strutturalismo, again from 2003, Giochi di potere sulla paranoia politica from 2007, La vita, un'invenzione recente from 2010, and the English translation of this book is forthcoming with Minnesota University Press in, I think, a very brief period. He's also...
You're very optimistic.
Ah, okay. He also curated and revised the Italian edition of Freud's Group Psychology and the Analysis of the Ego. And currently he's completing two new books. The first, entitled The Missing People, Psychoanalysis, Ontology, Politics, which focuses on psychoanalysis and political theory, and, correct me if I'm wrong, Davide, includes, among other things, a fundamental analysis of fascism.
You're right.
Okay. And the second one, provision entitled The Biopolitical Turn, Theory and Practice of Pure Life, which aims at promoting a new approach to biopolitical studies. The following debate with Davide will be structured so that he will first have around 20-30 minutes to present some general remarks regarding the problem of fascism today, and especially regarding the problem of our understanding and difficulties in grasping this phenomenon properly. And then the members of our Central Committee Board will ask some questions.
A fake collective.
And of course, after this, we will open discussion also for the audience. So at this point, I give a word to Davide by returning to the initial remark on the obscenity of fascism, since it ended up to be an ironic remark. In fact, the obscenity of fascism immediately recalls to Pier Paolo Pasolini's famous film Salò, or 120 Days of Sodoma. Davide and correct me if I'm wrong, it was Pier Paolo Pasolini that was the first in one of the first in the history who claimed that we still live in fascism, having in mind by this expression something that goes far beyond the notion of absolute evil and that has much more to do with something that is at least latently present in everyday reality.
You're always right, Boštjan. Okay. Thank you for having me here. I was told that this was a debate, not a presentation, but so this is the first time I have to give a presentation without a written text under my nose. So I hope my English will be clear enough. First of all, I would like to say that in my view, it is not exact that we live in times of crisis. It would be better to say that we live in times of fascism. And the very word crisis is part and parcel of the propaganda, I would say fascist propaganda, that we should resist and oppose. So in order to briefly explain why I'm saying this, I will try to raise three questions. The first one is, what is fascism, simply said. The second one is, I will say a few words about so-called neoliberalism. What is neoliberalism? And finally, I will go back to the question of fascism, and I will try to explain why we can distinguish between two different types of fascism, what Pier Paolo Pasolini used to call techno-fascism, our present situation, and ethno-fascism, the old form or the old type of fascism. So, what is fascism to begin with? The first point I want to make is that, in my view, we do not have any reliable concept or theory of fascism today. Of course, a lot of people gave us definitions, several definitions of fascism, from Hannah Arendt to Barrington Moore and many others, Georg Mosse, a few historians. But neither of them really captures what I think is the real essence of fascism. And the reason for this is that I think we retrospectively look at fascism from our historical and political perspective, which has been shaped in the aftermath of World War II and is still framed by post-war political assumptions about democracy. According to post-war constitutions, for instance the Italian constitution, but also the German constitution, also the French constitution, democracy as such won the war against fascism, and this means that democracy is in the end incompatible with fascism, and vice versa. Fascism would be incompatible from this perspective with democracy. For instance, any apology of fascism is anti-democratic by itself and must be forbidden by law, according to Italian law. When it comes to the historical or the philosophical analysis of fascism, this is not without consequences, I think, because this means that fascism is to be seen as the opposite of democracy, as the antithesis of democracy. Even Emilio Gentile, who is an Italian historian, who is probably today the best student of fascism, does not emphasize the strict connection between fascism and democracy. Gentile rather insists on conceiving fascism as antithetical to democracy in his analysis of what fascism was during the 30s. But the fact is that this is not true, in the sense that this is not the way fascist people, fascist intellectuals, fascist political leaders saw fascism. According to them, fascism was in fact not the antithesis of democracy. Rather, and this is a quote, fascism is the most candid form of democracy. This quote is taken from the entry Fascism of the Encyclopedia Treccani, written in the 30s by Giovanni Gentile, not Emilio Gentile, Giovanni, the Italian philosopher, and signed by, not by him, but by Benito Mussolini. But not only for Gentile and Mussolini, or for Schmidt, for instance, but also for many other scholars living at the time of fascism in the 30s. For people like Gaetano Salvemini, for instance, an Italian historian who was forced into exile by Mussolini and then became a prominent intellectual in the US. This was one of the basic, the main features of fascism. According to Salvemini, fascist people think of fascism, this is a quote, as a form of true, real, and fully accomplished democracy. Now, in the light of this, fascism, I think, should not be regarded as an anti-democratic political movement or political regime, but rather as a kind of pseudo-democratic regime. Fascism is not, or was not, experienced as the opposite of democracy, but rather should be seen as a kind of distortion of democracy, which is not alien to democracy. A kind of potentiality of Western modern democracy. In other words, fascism is a kind of false achievement or accomplishment of the democratic promise. At least in the eyes of fascists. This is the reason why fascism is a political phenomenon that can see the light of the day only within the context of modern democracies. But this is also the reason why, within such a context, I think we should always, or at least periodically, ask ourselves, do we live in a fascist regime? Now, second point, what is neoliberalism? Neoliberalism, first of all, is not a school of economic thought. Economists rather speak of neoclassical economics, not of neoliberal economics. Furthermore, I think that neoliberalism should not be associated, for reasons that we can discuss later on, with the so-called Austrian school of economics, from Mises, Ludwig von Mises to Friedrich von Hayek to Milton Friedman. In a sense, neoliberalism is more similar to an art of government, as Foucault famously put it in the 70s. But more precisely, I would rather speak of an art of reasoning, or of a philosophy, in the strongest sense of the word. Because neoliberalism, in fact, in the end, provides a full and exhaustive interpretation of the human condition. In this sense, neoliberalism today can be compared with social Darwinism. And it represents, in fact, a new version of social Darwinism. the role neoliberalism plays today is the same as the role played by social Darwinism a century ago. It is the means by which a political or fascist regime can be legitimated in the eyes of the public opinion. The basic tenets, The basic tenets of neoliberalism have been put forth by Gary Becker in the 60s and 70s. In his path-breaking The Economic Approach to Human Behavior, Becker writes, this is a quote, all human behavior can be viewed as involving participants who maximize their utility from a stable set of preferences and accumulate an optimal amount of information and other inputs in a variety of markets. If this argument is correct, the economic approach provides a unified framework for understanding behavior that has long been sought by and eluded Bentham, Comte, Marx, and others. End of quote. The idea here is that the economic calculation can be applied and should be applied to every field of human activity, because it can and should maximize its efficiency. By the way, the same approach, what Becker calls the economic approach, in his view, can be applied also to the field of biological research. This is another quote. This is to confirm the comparison between social Darwinism and neoliberalism today. The economic approach assumes that whole behavior results from maximizing utility functions. Survival value is partly a result of utility maximization in different social and physical environments. It's a very ambitious program of research. What we usually call neoliberalism today in everyday life, in our public debates, is one specific application of such economic calculations to every human activity dealing with the idea of justice. Justice can and should be maximized by adopting forms or by following patterns of economic reasoning. This is why I would tend to describe neoliberalism as an art of reasoning. Now, this kind of application of economic calculation to the idea of justice can be done in different ways. Richard Posner, one of Becker's colleagues at the University of Chicago and the author of another path-breaking contribution entitled The Economics of Justice, was one of the first to apply the economic approach to the field of legal thinking and jurisprudence at large. Posner is one of the fathers of the so-called economic analysis of law, or law and economics, which, according to the French legal scholar Alain Soupiot, in his last book, La gouvernance par le nombre, had a huge impact on the way law has been interpreted by the European Court of Justice over the last 30 years. But what if we apply the economic approach not to legal theory, but to political theory and politics at large? Then we find ourselves obliged to discuss matters of social justice, human justice, moral justice, only and exclusively in terms of economic calculations and economic efficiency. from a strictly philosophical point of view, this marks the end of philosophy itself. It represents, in a sense, the bankrupt of political philosophy, which comes to coincide with the rise of an intolerant doctrine about justice. A theory of justice is the title of such a doctrine, which was also named La Pensée Unique in France a few years ago. I will not expand on this, but let me just say that John Rawls, who is usually considered one of the most important political philosophers of the left, is actually one of the key figures of what we may call the neoliberal turn of contemporary political thinking. In order to prove it, suffice to quote a few lines from Posner's book, The Economics of Justice. In the introduction, Posner obviously makes reference to Gary Becker's contribution, The Economic Approach to Human Behavior. And he writes, the modern revival of interest in applying economics to non-market behavior begins with Gary Becker of the University of Chicago, his colleague. But a few pages earlier, in the preface, the whole book, begins with these words. I use justice, in inverted comma, in approximately the sense of John Rawls. Then a quote from Rawls' Theory of Justice follows. Third point. Do we live in a fascist regime today? I think so. And unfortunately, I'm not the first one to make such a claim about the current situation. Sheldon Wolin, W-O-L-I-N, one of the most original American political theorists of the past 30 years, wrote a book published in 2008 entitled Democracy Incorporated, Managed Democracy and the Spectre of Inverted Totalitarianism. This book is about the fascist or the totalitarian moment of the Bush administrations during and after the Second Gulf War. Wolin overtly draws a comparison between the Nazi regime and the American system. I'm not going to quote from his book, but from an article that you can find easily online, entitled A Kind of Fascism is Replacing Our Democracy. He refers only and exclusively to America. And he writes, the drive toward total power can take different forms, as Mussolini's Italy, Hitler's Germany, and Stalin's Soviet Union suggest. The American system is evolving its own form. That is, inverted totalitarianism. This has no official doctrine of racism or extermination camps, but it displays similar contempt for restraints. Then Wolin goes on emphasizing a few features of this inverted totalitarianism. While the Nazis focused upon mobilizing and unifying the society, inverted totalitarianism exploits political apathy and encourages divisiveness. Moreover, the Nazis abolished the parliamentary system, instituted single-party rule, and controlled all forms of public communications. It is possible, however, to reach a similar result without seeming to suppress. In that case, the system responds primarily to corporate interests. Voters become cynical, resigned, and opposition seems useless. Then he goes on insisting on the control and the manipulation of the media. And he concludes that a kind of, as the title says, as the title of this paper says, that a kind of fascism is replacing our democracy. Now, are we safe from such a danger, we, here and now, in Europe today? According to Gustavo Zagrebelsky, former president of the Italian Supreme Court, we are not safe from that danger. In his last book, this book, published a few months ago, entitled Mosca Cieca, that can be rendered in English as Blind Man's Bath, Zagrebelsky tries to show that we are getting closer and closer to a fascist regime, at least in Italy. And this not from an abstract, theoretical, philosophical point of view, but from a strictly institutional point of view. In particular, he sheds light on two aspects of this process. The first one is what he calls the anti-parliamentarism, or the general tendency to discredit parliamentary debates, which are no longer seen as a source of democracy, of democratic life, but rather as a way of wasting time. Mussolini and Hitler had exactly the same discrediting attitude towards parliamentary activity. And the recent constitutional reform in Italy ratifies such discredit by increasing, as Zagrebelsky points out, the powers of the executive in a very dangerous way. Another aspect on which Zagrebelsky draw our attention is what he calls, referring to the Nazi regime, the Gleichschaltung. That is, Gleichschaltung is a German word, meaning the coordination or the synchronization between the state and the party, and between the central government and the local peripheral authorities, the regional authorities, by means of which a totalitarian state was technically established in Germany in 1933. Today, the same kind of centralization is at work in Italy, but more generally, I think that we may say that a kind of Gleichschaltung is taking place also between the European Union on the one side and each member state on the other side. By virtue of this kind of new Gleichschaltung, contrary to customary beliefs, the European states are not losing power or sovereignty, but they are, on the contrary, increasing their power. Today, thanks to this kind of European Gleichschaltung, European institutions and European nation-states are strengthening and reinforcing each other, because the state, or the government, has to comply with the recommendations coming from Brussels and not with those coming from below, from the people. We are witnessing once again a kind of absolutization of the state's power, which is no longer subject to the people's approval, to the people's will, to the people's sovereignty. Obviously, the similarities between our situation and the situation in the 30s must not be exaggerated. If we are really entering a new fascist age, we must also be aware of the fact that contemporary fascism is an altogether different kind of fascism. Pasolini already in the 70s spoke of techno-fascism, and we can contrast this kind of techno-fascism with the old ethno-fascism, with the old kind of fascism. By the way, the two are not incompatible, and in a sense, techno-fascism paves the way for the resurgence or the revival of ethno-fascism. And probably this is what is happening right now in Europe. But again, what is fascism? It is a distortion of democracy, or a kind of pseudo-democracy, as I said before. While living in a fascist regime, also in the past, no one actually felt or feels like living in a non-democratic or anti-democratic regime. How is that possible? I want just to raise the question. Is that enough?
So I give the word to members of our committee.
I wanted to wait for a while to pose this question because it's not very, I don't think it's very essential, but however, but in a way it kind of proves your point, I would say, if I add a bit of imagination. So if you take a look at the American election, it's the only election process that still exists in public, because in Europe we actually don't have this, political propaganda is quite non-existent because the elections are taken as not being very serious stuff. We sense it correctly. But in America there is still some spectacle, but okay, if you take a look at the difference between, let's say, the two types of fascism would then be like Donald Trump on one hand and Hillary Clinton on the other, right? So, but if you take a look at, Trump has this strange joy in naming other people, He says, for Hillary Clinton is crooked Hillary. For Ted Cruz is lying Ted. For Marco Rubio is little Marco. So it seems like like characters from a Western or something like that, crooked Hillary, lying Ted, little Marco. That would be some people in Texas, right? And then he has this fourth, for Bernie Sanders, he has this crazy Bernie. But I think you get this kind of, as I see it, with this crooked Hillary is a great expression. I think that she is Hillary Clinton is crooked Hillary. Ted Cruz is lying Ted. Marco Rubio is little Marco, in a sense that he is a politician that wanted to become a president but has no really potential to become one. But when he says crazy Bernie to Bernie Sanders, he kind of misses the point, what Bernie Sanders is about. Not only from the real perspective, but I think even Trump senses that this is a bad expression for Bernie Sanders. He misses his essence in a way. So the point would be that Donald Trump manages to name correctly only those politicians who already are a part of this double fascism. So he is in a way as a propaganda for fascism, in a sense that if he wins, one type of fascism will win, and if he loses, the other type of fascism will win. So we have, in both cases, the fascism will triumph. But I think that might be a signal that he is unable to give a proper name to a politician that kind of escapes this system that he is actually a part of. So that would be just it's not a question, it's more like a remark. So maybe something more.
You want to reply something to?
No.
It's okay.
I don't think that I don't like Trump, of course. I do not. But I'm writing this book about political theory, psychoanalysis, where I try to develop kind of new theory of modern politics. In the light of what I've written in this book, I wouldn't say that in America, what I call old fascism or ethno-fascism would be a concrete possibility. And historically, it has not been a possibility. It can be a possibility only in the presence, this kind of fascism, ethno-fascism, of a very specific form of nationalism, which is not religious nationalism such as Anglican nationalism in England in the 17th century. It is not civic nationalism such as French nationalism at the outbreak of the revolution at the end of the 18th century, but has to be a third form of nationalism, which is ethno-nationalism, ethnic nationalism, such as German nationalism in the 19th century, or Italian nationalism. It is only against this background that something like ethno-fascism, the old form of fascism, becomes a concrete possibility. So in the I tend to see Trump as a populist, just to use this abused word. But also, let me say, as an expression of democracy, because Trump gives voice, actually, to all those people in America who are against what we may call the system, or a kind of techno-fascism that is well represented, I think, by Clinton. Actually, it was Bill Clinton who abolished in 1999 the Glass-Steagall Act, and this was the beginning of the end. Mm-hmm. But, okay, this is not a...
Just to add, so... okay, I can pose this question afterwards because it's more like focused on the European situation. I would just like you to, but okay, I would just like you to hear what difference you see between, you know, what that Boštjan mentioned, this Visegrad group that is forming right now. I mean, it's establishing itself as a political factor, and the European People's Party that has existed, you know, as a transnational organization for a long time, and that Viktor Orban was actually, I think, a vice president of. So, can you give a comment on this difference? Because kind of, I see no. I mean, the European People's Party actually now seems to be is presented as an opponent to these countries. But actually, the politicians that are in the government of these parties are at the same time members of the European People's Party. You know, so
okay. Let me take it from a different point of view. What I'm trying to say, in an oversimplified form, is that we in Europe we are squashed between two different forms of fascism. Orban's fascism, which is the revival of this kind of ethno-fascism, but it is always on the edge between nationalism, traditional forms of nationalism, ethno-nationalism, and fascism, properly speaking. And the most dangerous form of fascism today, which is the fascism represented by the European institutions. why did I speak of John Rawls and of neoliberalism? Because I'm trying to suggest that the defeat of the left in the past few years, in the past few decades, has something to do with what I call the bankrupt of political theory, or the bankrupt of political philosophy. And this bankrupt can be dated from 1971, when A Theory of Justice was published. This book had a huge impact on the leftist parties all over Europe, not only in America. The very idea of fairness that stands at the center of this book, fairness instead of justice, was crucial to Crax's Socialist Party's propaganda, for instance, in the 80s. So when we speak of neoliberal turn, of neoliberalism, we should keep in mind, we should bear in mind that we are speaking not only of bad people like Hayek, Friedman. No, we are speaking of people who we think are close to us, but who are in the end the true enemies today of the left and, by the same token, of democracy as such. So I don't know if I really answer your question, but it doesn't matter.
Okay, so my question would basically regard the question of the leader. So in the old ethno-fascist or Nazi regime, it was obviously this certain figure of a leader, but I'm not talking about the leader in the sense of the one who leads, rather about this central grotesque figure, some sort of thickening of this grotesque aspect of the certain regime. So in some way, it seems to me that this thickening of the grotesque in a way misses in what you refer to as techno-fascism. So basically my question is, I mean, and I'm really not going in direction of totalitarianism as the essence of fascist regime. Obviously, I really don't believe this. I think that it's quite possible that, for instance, Nazi regime and democracy in a way could coexist. I mean, obviously also in the historical sense of Nazism being actually democratically elected and so on. It's more the question of this grotesque element, which was in a way, I find it essential for instance, historical Nazism or fascism, in this sense that also of the aspects of the population who were not ideologically fascist or Nazis, but I would call them in a way non-innocent outside. So people who in a way failed or became immune to the grotesque nature of figures like Mussolini or Hitler. So in a way, this would be some sort of kind of a co-direction, but the main question is the question of a leader in technocratic system or with regards to fascism.
Mm-hmm. Well, I would say that strong political leadership, or populism, if you wish, is everywhere along the spectrum of contemporary politics. I remember a few years ago, I was invited to a kind of secret meeting with the former secretary of the Partito Democratico, Pierluigi Bersani, in Italy, in Rome. And at the beginning, someone, maybe him, but I don't remember exactly, or Gianni Letta, who was sitting beside, Enrico Letta, not Gianni Letta, says that we had to avoid the danger of populism, at least from the left. I remember that a few hours later I replied that it was difficult, if not impossible today, to avoid being populist. And as a matter of fact, a few years later, Matteo Renzi replaced Bersani as the leader of the Partito Democratico. So the real question from my point of view is why political leadership becomes so important in our days. Why, in his group psychology, Freud speaks of two different kinds, implicitly, of two different kinds of leadership. There is, on the one side, what he calls the secondary leader, obeying the social Vorbilder, so obeying some kind of entering or fitting in with some kind of predetermined cultural and political frame, and the primary leadership, which is what we call today the populist leadership. This has to do, I think, with many things, but first of all with this kind of anti-parliamentarism I referred to before. When parliamentary activity becomes irrelevant or is discredited, the entire democratic mechanism doesn't work any longer. At that point, a direct relationship with the people, or between the leader, the political leader, and the people, becomes crucial. And this concerns the entire spectrum of political parties or political movements. So you have populist leaders on the right and on the left, on the side of the what we may call the system, and on the side of the anti-system movement, because it would be undeniable that Matteo Renzi in Italy is populist, as much as Matteo Salvini on the opposite front, the leader of the Lega Nord. But definitely, this is a very good question. There are many ways of answering this question. This is probably the most superficial one, but
I have to admit I am still struggling with and trying to grasp what you presented us here. There are many interesting points here, but first of all I would like to understand how you came from the fascism to neoliberalism, because in a way for me in neoliberalism you have this strange kind of collective. In Mirowski's analysis and in Harvey's analysis, you have this kind of collective, and Mirowski calls it neoliberal thinking collective. And the paradox of neoliberals from the very beginning was that they denied they are neoliberals. Nobody wanted to be called a neoliberal from the very beginning. And when you try to find the center, Mirowski tries to find the center, where does neoliberalism come from? He finds a solution called a Russian doll, so babushka. And in a way, you don't have the center, you have only layers. You have, I don't know, you have the core, and then you have a little more outside, etc., etc. So there are parallels, I agree, between fascism and neoliberalism. And Mirowski tries to find out some parallels between Carl Schmitt and others, etc. But the more fundamental question for me, and it's a very naive one, is can we speak about fascism without reference to order and mobilization? So what kind of order are you talking about?
Boštjan, can I actually add to this? Because my question is very much related to what Peter was asking, and I'll try to keep it very simple. My question is even more simple, which is simply, what exactly is the benefit of using the term fascism? And of course, it's a question the question is begged, or how do you translate it? But you could also add that there are, of course, also elements of feudalism in contemporary situation, but not just historical feudalism, but kind of techno-feudalism or something like that. If you consider the idea of private armies and so on, if you consider the idea of like these oligarchs ruling, basically feudally, designating their lords to oversee certain sectors. So, I mean, what exactly do we gain by saying techno-fascism and not just technocracy, which seems to be the usual term to describe processes such as those going on in European Union?
Yeah. I will start with Gregor's question. I cannot explain why I adopt this definition of fascism. I try to do it in the book. But in a sense, it is legitimate in the light of what I have been saying so far. Because in my own definition, fascism is simply a form of pseudo-democracy. This is the crucial point for me. Pseudo-democracy. Pseudo from pseudos, a false or a fake democracy. The people in the 30s were not aware that they were actually exiting the frame of democracy. On the contrary, they believed that they were altogether achieving democracy, going beyond what they used to call liberal democracies. So the opposition was between liberal democracies, parliamentary democracies, and a new form, an accomplished form of democracy, the true achievement of democracy, of modern democracy, okay? So this is one of the main features of fascism, its pseudo-democratic appearance. And this is the reason why I think today we can use the same word, because no one is aware of the fact that we are already out of the democratic frame in Europe today. Regarding neoliberalism, I have emphasized that I do not see neoliberalism as a synonym of fascism. Not at all. Neoliberalism has to be understood, I think. And in this sense, neoliberalism is similar to social Darwinism, as I said before. In the 30s, a particular science, biology, and what we may call the art of reasoning, taking our cue from biological statements stemming from social Darwinism, were applied to, were used in order to better understand society as such, or history as such. Today, it is no longer biology, but rather economics that plays this role. And we have this so-called economic approach to human behavior in general. So neoliberalism is to put it in a very simple way, the ideological support of contemporary fascism, of what I tend to call contemporary fascism or techno-fascism. Yes, you're right. Techno-fascism, or this new form of fascism, is quite different from the old one. But I stick to the definition of fascism because it is a kind of distortion of democracy.
But don't you think that precisely this position is something you try to avoid at the very beginning of your talk? Because you said the political tradition always tries to define fascism vis-à-vis democracy. So,
not vis-à-vis democracy.
Perhaps it's
More or less, yeah, please.
No, perhaps there's a distinction here between institutional parliamentary democracy in a very juridical sense, on the one hand, and a kind of substantial, authentic, originally democracy, on the other hand, to which fascism, old fascism, was attached. So perhaps in this sense.
Okay. I see I see the problem. Actually, I'm trying. I must confess that I'm trying not to say too much.
Okay. But I will.
But in order to define fascism, obviously, we have first to define democracy.
Yeah. Okay.
This is the point Boštjan was making right now. Look, I will say a few things more if you wish, if we have time.
Yeah.
Just a few remarks. What is democracy? Modern democracy can be defined in many different ways, but in democratic theory, which is a specific small field of political science today, it is usually described as a combination of two different, and the coexistence of two different principles. The principle of popular sovereignty and the principle of individual or subjective rights. These two principles can be in turn defined or described in many different ways. Traditionally, they are termed majority rule on the one side and minority rights on the other side. I think that this is my point in the book, the point I try to make in this book, one of the points, that fascism consists in abolishing just one of the two pillars. And depending on which one we abolish, we suppress, we have two opposite kinds of fascism, which produce the appearance of democracy, the feeling that democracy is still alive, whereas democracy is over. In the case of old fascism, of ethno-fascism, the principle of individual rights or minority rights was suppressed right at the beginning, in 1933 in Germany. And the principle of popular sovereignty was, in a sense, absolutized, was made absolute, in the name of the master race, in the name of a sort of collective agglutination. But the very dynamic, the very democratic dynamic, which consists in a constant negotiation between majority rule and minority rights, was over, was abolished. Today we are experiencing something, the reverse, in a sense, I think. As a matter of fact, in Europe today, the principle of the people's sovereignty has been abolished. Think of Greece. But as a form of compensation, the principle of minority rights has been the more and more exalted. It is not by chance, from this angle, that at the climax of the economic crisis, a few years ago, when Greek people, Spanish people, Portuguese people were literally starving, at some point, all over Europe, another huge public debate took place. The debate about gay rights. I must make immediately a very important remark. I'm not against gay rights, obviously. I have many dear and close friends who are gay, so this is not the problem. I'm not against gay.
Davide, this is becoming very dangerous.
But what I want to emphasize, what I want to stress, is this kind of simultaneity between the fact that the people's sovereignty was called into doubt, was called into question, and this kind of compensation, of political compensation. All this occurred, I would say, at the level of the, let me put it this way, of the collective unconscious. No one was really aware of this kind of simultaneous distribution of questions and emphasis. But this was quite symptomatic from my point of view. That said, all this should be approached at a much deeper level, I think. So I'm trying to just give you my personal opinions. You have to take them as my personal opinions, not cool. In the book, actually, I try to analyze the rise and the meaning of the idea of popular sovereignty, and there are many contributions, and subjective rights, which is a bit more complicated question. Anyway, one of my points in this book is that we should change the register of political theory. We should not look at the historical process from above, from the perspective of political theory, of political philosophy, but from below, from the perspective of the people, the way the people themselves saw, for instance, the revolutionary moment at the end of the 18th century, or during the English civil wars and so forth. In a sense, this is a way of making things easier, because we can, at that point, we can get rid of many theoretical, very abstract problems, questions. And but this move obliges everyone to engage in the study of history instead of the study of philosophy. So when you're saying that all these notions are antagonistic or can be antagonized, I think that you are already taking a step against a specific historical background, which is the background from where your position or your language stems. And the problem is how to interpret this kind of historical provenance. And the problem is also how to reactivate it.
Maybe you have not fake democracy, but fake populism. That what we're dealing with, you know. Like, yeah, in case of Trump, you said that he is just a populist, but he is in a way a fake populist.
Yes, but you know, Trump is not such a novelty in the American historical landscape. Anyway, this is the point, more or less, you made yesterday, and I totally agree with you. I found this idea of courtly capitalism very interesting. And I think that the question, this is the deeper level of analysis, the one I didn't want to address here. Let me just say one thing. The question of enjoyment from a psychological point of view has to be connected, put in relation with the question of subjectification. There are many types of enjoyment, of course, jouissance, according to the type of subjectification. And Lacan gives us the analysis of different types, which correspond to different clinical subjective positions, okay? I think that what you were saying, in a sense, and this is a short circuit, in a sense explains why I am optimistic and probably you are optimistic about the future. I am optimistic about the future. But let me put it another way. We live in strange times, times of desubjectification or desubjectivation. Nonetheless, what also in the eyes of psychoanalysts, and here I'm just trying to say something in a very allusive way, okay? Psychoanalysts today are facing what they tend to call the new symptoms. That is to say, new forms of subjectification, new forms of subjectivity, which emerge and take the shape at first sight of so many forms of desubjectification. One of the main contributions Pasolini gave us, I think, is his last book, Oil, Petrolio, which is a book about Carlo, who is not one. There are many Carlo. Carlo is a desubjectified person or subject. And Pasolini, at some point in the book, says something. He says, I read Freud, I read Lacan as well, and I cannot understand Carlo's psychology, to put it in this way, by reading them. I cannot find anything in these authors that allows me to understand what's going on in Carlo's mind. Pasolini is suggesting something. He is suggesting that this form of desubjectification, or this loss of enjoyment, if you want, is still a kind of clinical subjective position, but a different kind. And the problem for me, the question for me, and I think this is a question also for psychoanalysts, is as follows. Does Lacan actually give us the tools that allows us to understand this new kind of subjectivity or this kind of loss of enjoyment? You referred to the and this is the ambiguity I noticed yesterday in your presentation. This reference to sublimation, courtly love, in a sense, in those passages, Lacan was speaking of something else. He was speaking, in a sense, to make a long story short, he was speaking of what we can expect from psychoanalysis itself. But at the same time, you're speaking of something that should appear before the treatment. No? So there was a kind of ambiguity in this aspect of your presentation. Anyway, this is a very deep and important question. And I would stop here. But
I declare
literally
finished this session, and we meet again after 15 minutes with the last panel entitled "The Turning Point of No Return."